The heavy oak doors of Cedar Hill Manor closed behind me with a familiar creak that echoed through the entrance hall. I stood there for a moment, taking in the scent of lemon polish and old wood that had defined my childhood home. The afternoon, sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns across the marble floor. The same floor I once slid across in my socks while my father pretended not to notice. "Sarah, so glad you could make it. We were beginning to wonder." My brother Michael's voice carried down the grand staircase, dripping with that particular tone he reserved for me. Polite condescension wrapped in fake warmth. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." He descended with measured steps, every inch the successful attorney in his tailored suit, not a hair out of place. Behind him trailed Rebecca, my sister, phone pressed to her ear as always. "Listen, just stall the contractors until Monday. I don't care what it costs." She ended the call without saying goodbye, slipping her phone into the pocket of her designer blazer before offering me a quick, practiced smile. "Sarah, you look comfortable." I glanced down at my simple black dress, the only formal outfit I owned, suddenly aware of the coffee stain I'd tried to scrub out that morning. Next to Rebecca's pearls and Michael's gold cufflinks, I might as well have been wearing pajamas. "The reading of the will starts in 10 minutes, Michael announced, checking his watch. Our father's watch, I noticed with a pang. "Daniel's already?" "In the study with Ms. Chen." Rebecca nodded, already looking bored. "Let's get this over with. The sooner we settle everything, the sooner Cedar Hill can go on the market." I felt my chest tighten. "You're selling the house? Already?" My voice sounded small even to me. Michael and Rebecca exchanged a look I knew all too well, the one that said, "Poor naive Sarah." "Of course we are," Rebecca said slowly, as though explaining to a child. "What would we do with a massive Victorian that costs a fortune to maintain? Besides, the land alone is worth millions to developers." "But it's been in our family for generations," I protested. "Mom and Dad loved this place." Michael sighed. "And now they're gone, Sarah. It's time to be practical." I bit my tongue as I followed them toward the study. My siblings had always been practical, a quality our father rewarded handsomely during his life. While they followed in his business-minded footsteps, Michael becoming a corporate lawyer, Rebecca launching a successful real estate company, I'd pursued a career in art restoration. My parents had been supportive in their way, paying for my education, but never quite understanding why I'd choose passion over profit. Now, with both Mom and Dad gone within months of each other, I knew where I stood in the hierarchy. The youngest. The dreamer. The afterthought. Grace Chen's office in the east wing of Cedar Hill Manor had once been my father's favorite reading room. Now, legal documents were spread across his antique mahogany desk, the bookshelves stripped of his beloved first editions. Grace, a petite woman in her 60s with a sleek silver bob and sharp eyes that missed nothing, gestured for us to take our seats. "Now that everyone's here, we can proceed with the reading of Thomas and Eleanor Mitchell's last will and testament," she began, her voice calm and professional. Rebecca's husband, Daniel, a tall man with a permanent expression of calculation, was already taking notes on his tablet. I'd never liked Daniel, with his cold efficiency and the way he looked at Cedar Hill Manor like a balance sheet rather than a home. "As you know," Grace continued, "your parents updated their will shortly before your father's diagnosis. Everything is quite straightforward." What followed was indeed straightforward and devastating. The family's stock portfolio split between Michael and Rebecca, the vacation property in Maine to Rebecca, my father's share in his investment firm to Michael, the art collection I'd helped my mother curate over the years, divided between them. Even my grandmother's antique jewelry collection, which Mom had always promised would come to me, was designated for Rebecca. And for me? A modest trust fund that would barely cover rent for a few years, and my mother's personal diaries. I sat perfectly still as Grace read through the allocations, each statement hitting like a physical blow. My siblings' faces remained impassive, occasionally nodding as another asset was added to their column. "And that concludes the formal distribution of assets," Grace finally said, closing the folder. Michael cleared his throat. "It's exactly as Dad always discussed. Taking care of business interests first, ensuring everything stays properly managed." Rebecca reached over to squeeze my hand with performative sympathy. "The diaries are special. Sarah, Mom knew how sentimental you are." I couldn't even look at her. Sentimental. The Mitchell family's polite word for impractical, emotional, unmarketable. "Is there anything else?" I asked Grace, my voice barely steady. She hesitated, an emotion I couldn't quite read crossing her face. "No, that's everything outlined in the official will filed with the court. There are some personal effects still to be sorted through, of course." "We should get that done this weekend," Daniel interjected. "The estate agent wants to list the property by next month. The market's hot right now." "This weekend?" I echoed. "But there's so much to go through. Mom and Dad's belongings, the library, Sarah," Michael cut in with exaggerated patience. "Rebecca and I have real jobs and responsibilities. We've already taken time off for the funeral, and now this. We can't keep putting our lives on hold." I wanted to scream that our parents' lives, their memories, weren't an inconvenience to be efficiently managed. Instead, I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "Fine, I'll help sort things." Rebecca's phone buzzed. She glanced at it and stood up. "Great, that's settled. I have a call with investors in 20 minutes. Michael, can you handle the paperwork with Grace?" "Of course," he replied smoothly. "Sarah, why don't you start looking through Mom's things? You always had a knack for the sentimental stuff." I watched them exit the study, Rebecca already. On her phone, Michael and Daniel discussing tax implications, leaving me alone with Grace. "I'm sorry, Sarah," the lawyer said quietly once they were gone. "I know this isn't what you expected." I shook my head, blinking back tears. "It's fine. My parents were always practical people." Grace gave me a strange look. "Were they?" Before I could ask what she meant, she too gathered her papers and left me sitting alone in what had once been my father's sanctuary, now stripped of everything that made it his. I wandered through Cedar Hill Manor that evening, touching familiar surfaces, breathing in memories that seemed to cling to the walls. In the kitchen, I found the mark on the doorframe where my height had been measured each birthday. In the conservatory, the piano where my mother taught me to play Chopin. Everywhere, echoes of a family that had once been whole. My bedroom remained largely untouched. The twin bed with its faded quilt, bookshelves lined with childhood favorites, a collection of art supplies I'd abandoned when I moved out for college. Sitting on the edge of the bed, I opened the box containing my mother's diaries, apparently my inheritance. The leather-bound journals spanned decades, from before my parents' marriage through our childhoods. I opened the earliest one, recognizing my mother's elegant handwriting. April 18th, 1980. Thomas proposed today by the lighthouse. I said yes, of course. He talks about building an empire, but all I want is a family, a real home. We'll find the balance, I'm sure of it. I closed the diary, unable to read more through my tears. What had happened to that young woman who valued home and family above empire building? Somewhere along the way, my parents had changed. Or perhaps I'd never really known them at all. My phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca. Meeting estate agent tomorrow at 9. Be ready to discuss staging the house. Staging. As if Cedar Hill Manor were just another property in her portfolio. I was about to turn off my light when a memory surfaced. My Mother, weeks before her sudden heart attack, asking me to help her clean out her art studio in the attic. "There are things up there I've been meaning to sort through," she'd said. "Things that should be properly taken care of." We'd never gotten around to it. With Mom's unexpected death and Dad's decline immediately after, the attic had remained untouched. On impulse, I grabbed a flashlight and made my way up the narrow stairs to the third floor, then up the even narrower attic stairs. The door stuck, as it always had, requiring a firm push before it groaned open. The attic was exactly as I remembered, dusty, beams crossing the ceiling, dormered windows letting in the moonlight, boxes and trunks creating a labyrinth of family history. In the far corner stood my mother's art studio, her easel draped with a cloth, her paints dried up in their tubes. I moved toward it slowly, remembering afternoons spent watching her paint landscapes and family portraits. She'd been talented, good enough to sell her work if she'd wanted to, but my father had always dismissed it as Eleanor's little hobby. Behind the easel stood an old wardrobe that had belonged to my great-grandmother. I pulled open its doors, expecting mothballs and vintage clothing. Instead, I found a small safe I'd never seen before, its digital keypad glowing faintly in the dark. My heart pounded as I stared at it. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Why would my mother have a hidden safe in her art studio? And more importantly, what was inside it? I tried the obvious combinations first. My parents' anniversary, their birth dates, our birth dates. Nothing worked. Frustrated, I sat on a nearby trunk, shining my flashlight around the studio for inspiration. The beam caught a painting I hadn't noticed before, half hidden behind a stack of canvases. I pulled it out carefully, a watercolor of the old oak tree behind the house, the one with the treehouse my father had built for us. At the bottom, my mother had written, "Where dreams were shared, 11/22/71. My breath caught. November 22nd, 1971. The day my parents first met, according to family lore, a chance encounter beneath that very oak tree during an autumn storm. With trembling fingers, I punched in 11/22/71. The safe clicked open. Inside were several folders, a small jewelry box, and an envelope with my name written in my mother's handwriting. Not Michael's name, not Rebecca's. Mine. I reached for it, my heart racing, but froze at the sound of footsteps on the stairs. "Sarah? Are you up here?" Michael's voice carried through the attic door. "What are you doing in the dark?" Quickly, I grabbed the envelope and closed the safe, throwing a canvas over it just as my brother appeared in the doorway. "There you are," he said, frowning as he took in the dusty studio. "What are you doing up here at this hour?" I slipped the envelope into my pocket. "Just remembering. Mom spent a lot of time here." Michael glanced around dismissively. "Yes," with her watercolors. "Listen, I'm heading out. Rebecca and Daniel are already gone. Don't forget about the meeting tomorrow." "I won't." He paused, his expression softening slightly. "Look, Sarah, I know the will was disappointing for you, but Dad always said you had the most heart out of all of us, the least head for business. He was protecting you, in his way." "From what? Having assets? Making decisions?" Michael sighed. "From making mistakes? You know how you are, all emotion, no strategy. Dad worried you'd squander anything significant he left you. The casual cruelty of his assessment, and worse, the certainty that our father had shared it, left me speechless. Anyway," he continued, checking his watch, "get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be a long day." After he left, I remained in the attic, clutching the envelope in my pocket, too afraid to open it with Michael still in the house. Only when I heard his car pull away did I return to my bedroom, lock the door, and finally examine my mother's letter. The envelope was sealed with wax, an old-fashioned touch typical of my mother. Inside was a single sheet of her personal stationery, dated just 2 weeks before her death. My dearest Sarah, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and you've remembered our conversation about the attic. You always were the one who listened, truly listened. What I couldn't say then, I must say now. Your father and I made choices I've come to regret. Choices that prioritized wealth and status over the values we once held dear. Michael and Rebecca followed our example too well, becoming reflections of our worst qualities rather than our best. But you, my Sarah, you stayed true to yourself. You chose passion over profit, kindness over advantage. I've watched you struggle to fit into the family your father and I created, never realizing that your difference was your strength. There is another will, Sarah. One that reflects what's in my heart, not what's been dictated by decades of family politics. Grace Chen has it, along with instructions. The combination to the safe is the date your father proposed. The last day I truly felt we were making decisions from love rather than obligation. Whatever happens next, know that I am prouder of you than you can imagine. All my love, Mom, Jai. Read the letter 3 times, my hands shaking more with each reading. Another will? Hidden with Grace Chen, who had sat silently through the reading of a will she apparently knew wasn't my mother's final word? And the safe. I'd used the wrong date. Not when they met, but when they got engaged. I returned to the attic, this time entering the date from my mother's first diary entry, 04/18/80. The safe opened again, and this time I removed everything. The folders, the jewelry box, and most crucially, a sealed legal envelope marked Last Will and Testament of Eleanor Mitchell Revised. As I held it, a warmth spread through me despite the attic's chill. My mother had seen me, really seen me. And somehow, from beyond the grave, she was giving me the chance to be seen by everyone else too. Tomorrow, my siblings would arrive with their plans and their spreadsheets, ready to dismantle our family home piece by profitable piece. They thought they knew exactly how this story would end. They had no idea what was coming. I closed the safe and gathered the documents, moving carefully back to my room. There, I spread everything across my childhood bed and began to read, understanding dawning with each page. By morning, I knew exactly what I had to do. When Michael's Mercedes pulled up the driveway at 8:55 a.m., followed shortly by Rebecca's Range Rover, I was waiting in the parlor, my mother's revised will and supporting documents arranged neatly on the coffee table. Grace Chen seated beside me, her professional demeanor firmly in place. The game was about to change, and for once, I knew all the rules. The look on Michael's face when he entered the parlor and saw Grace Chen sitting beside me was worth photographing. His confident stride faltered, just for a moment, before his lawyer's composure took over. "Grace, I didn't expect to see you. Again so soon." His tone was pleasant, but his eyes darted between us suspiciously. Rebecca and Daniel entered right behind him, deep in conversation about property values until they noticed our arrangement. Rebecca's perfectly manicured nails dug into her leather portfolio. "What's this about?" she asked, making no move to sit down. "Please, take a seat," Grace said, her professional demeanor unwavering. "There's been a development regarding your parents' estate." A development? Daniel's financial advisor instincts were clearly on high alert. The will was read yesterday. Everything was finalized. I watched them exchange glances, communicating in that silent language they'd developed over years of business dealings and family politics. They were already closing ranks, preparing to dismiss whatever complication had arisen. "Not everything," I said quietly. Michael sighed, checking his watch. "Sarah, the estate agent will be here in 20 minutes. Whatever this is about." "You might want to cancel that appointment," Grace interjected, her voice gentle but firm. "What we're about to discuss changes everything." That got their attention. All three sat down across from us, their postures stiff with reluctance. Grace placed her hand on the legal documents between us. Yesterday, I read Thomas and Eleanor Mitchell's joint will dated March 15th of last year. However, Eleanor executed a revised will 2 weeks before her death, which takes precedence over the previous document. That's ridiculous, Michael said, immediately. Mom was perfectly happy with the arrangements she and Dad made. Why would she change anything? I met his gaze steadily. Maybe she wasn't as happy as you thought. Rebecca leaned forward, eyes narrowing. If there was another will, why didn't you mention it yesterday, Grace? This seems highly irregular. Because Eleanor left specific instructions about its disclosure, Grace replied, unruffled by Rebecca's implied accusation. She requested that I first allow the original will to be read, and then provide the revised version to Sarah privately, who would decide when to reveal its existence. Daniel made a dismissive gesture. This sounds legally questionable at best. A conveniently discovered second will that apparently benefit Sarah? I'm not sure the courts would. The courts won't need to be involved, Grace interrupted, sliding a notarized document forward. This will was properly executed, witnessed, and registered with the state. Eleanor simply requested a specific procedure for its disclosure, which we are now following. I found Mom's letter last night, I added, watching their faces carefully, along with documentation explaining everything. Michael's expression hardened. What kind of documentation? Instead of answering, I opened the first folder from the safe. Did you know Mom kept detailed financial records? Not the official family accounts that Dad managed, but her own private tracking of where the money came from and where it went. Rebecca crossed her arms. Mom didn't know anything about finance. That was Dad's area. Actually, I continued, she knew quite a lot, especially about Grandpa William's trust, the one that provided the initial capital for Dad's business. For your law practice, Michael, and for your first development project, Rebecca. My siblings exchanged another look, this one tinged with uncertainty. What about it? Michael asked cautiously. Cedar Hill Manor wasn't purchased with Dad's earnings as we were always told. It was bought with trust money from Mom's side of the family. Money specifically designated to pass down through the female line of the Mitchell family. The room fell silent. Even Daniel, usually quick with financial counter-arguments, seemed taken aback. That's impossible, Rebecca finally said. Grandpa William was Dad's father. Yes, I agreed. But the trust came from great-grandmother Adelaide Mitchell, who stipulated that her assets should pass through the women in the family to preserve their financial independence. That's why it passed to Mom rather than directly to Dad. I handed Grace a yellowed legal document, which she placed on the table. This is the original trust documentation. Your mother kept it hidden because your father convinced her that revealing these terms would complicate the family's business arrangements. And she just went along with that? Rebecca asked incredulously. She did, I said softly, because she loved him, and because she believed in the family they were building together. But toward the end of her life, she began to regret how much of her own identity and her family's legacy had been subsumed into Dad's vision. Michael ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration I recognized from childhood. Even if this trust existed, it would have merged with the family assets decades ago. You can't just retroactively claim. Your mother never legally transferred the trust assets into the joint holdings, Grace interrupted. Thomas may have managed them as though they were his, but Eleanor maintained separate paperwork. Legally, Cedar Hill Manor and approximately 40% of the family's current wealth stems directly from Adelaide's trust. Daniel leaned forward, businessman's instincts fully engaged. Let's say this is true. What exactly does the revised will state? Grace opened the sealed envelope, though I already knew its contents from the copy in the safe. In brief, Eleanor, Mitchell revokes all previous distributions and establishes a new division of assets. The Adelaide Mitchell Trust properties, including Cedar Hill Manor and associated investments, passed directly to Sarah as the female heir, honoring the original terms. The remaining assets are divided equally among all 3 children. The silence that followed was absolute. I could almost see the calculations running behind my siblings' eyes. How much they stood to lose, what arguments they could make, whether fighting would be worth the cost. Rebecca recovered first. "This seems awfully convenient for you, Sarah." "Does it?" I asked, opening another folder. "Because here's the interesting part. If Mom had simply wanted to favor me, she could have just changed the percentages in the will. But that's not what this is about." I laid out a series of photographs, old family pictures I'd never seen before, women in early 20th century clothing standing proudly in front of Cedar Hill Manor, newspaper clippings about Adelaide Mitchell's unprecedented business acumen during the Depression, a handwritten letter from my great-grandmother to my grandmother, emphasizing the importance of financial independence. "This isn't about me getting more than you," I said, my voice steady despite the emotion tightening my throat. "It's about honoring the legacy that should never have been erased in the first place." Michael stared at the photographs, recognition slowly dawning. "These women, they're all Mitchell women," I finished for him. "The ones Dad never talked about, whose contributions were written out of the family history. The ones who actually built the foundation of wealth that all of us have benefited from." I picked up a particularly striking photograph. Adelaide Mitchell standing beside an early automobile, dressed in a businessman's suit rather than a dress, her expression fiercely determined. Great-grandmother Adelaide didn't just leave money. She left a vision for the women in her family, one that got lost when Dad took control of everything. I turned to Rebecca, whose expression had shifted from hostility to something more complicated, including the path Mom might have followed if she'd been encouraged to pursue her art professionally rather than treating it as a hobby. Rebecca's eyes flickered to the painting of Cedar Hill Manor hanging above the fireplace, one of our mother's finest works, which Rebecca had always admired. "Mom knew what she was doing when she revised her will," I continued. "She wasn't trying to punish either of you. She was trying to restore balance, to make sure that what had been buried wouldn't stay buried forever." Daniel, ever practical, cut through the sentiment. "Regardless of intent, this radically changes the distribution of assets. We'll need to consult our own legal counsel before accepting these terms." Grace nodded, unsurprised. "Of course. However, I should note that contesting the will triggers a clause directing all disputed assets to establish an arts foundation in Eleanor's name, removing them from family control entirely." Michael's jaw tightened. "She thought of everything, didn't she?" "She had 6 months between Dad's diagnosis and her own death," I said quietly. 6 months of clarity without his influence. I think she finally gave herself permission to set things right. Rebecca stood abruptly, walking to the window that overlooked the garden where our mother had spent countless hours. When she turned back, her expression was unreadable. "I need time to process this. All of it." Michael looked ready to argue, but something in Rebecca's stance stopped him. Instead, he gathered the documents, examining them with the scrutiny only a corporate lawyer could muster. "We'll postpone the meeting with the estate agent," he said finally. "Grace, please send copies of everything to my office. Sarah?" He hesitated, studying me as if seeing me for the first time. "It seems we have a lot to discuss." After they left, Michael to his office, Rebecca and Daniel to their car where they sat having an intense conversation I couldn't hear. Grace squeezed my hand. "Your mother would be proud of how you handled that." I nodded, emotion making it hard to speak. "Thank you for keeping her secret." "Eleanor and I went to college together, did you know that? Before she met your father, she had dreams of opening an art gallery. She was brilliant, vibrant." Grace's eyes grew distant with memory. When she called me about changing her will, it was like hearing my old friend again after decades of silence. I looked around the parlor, seeing it with new eyes, not just as my childhood home, but as a legacy passed through generations of women I'd never been told about. "What happens now?" I asked. Grace gathered her things. "They'll fight it at least at first. Your brother and sister are not accustomed to having their expectations thwarted, but the documentation is solid, and your mother was of entirely sound mind when she made these changes. Legally, you're on firm ground." After she left, I wandered through Cedar Hill Manor alone, really seeing it for the first time. I paused. In the library, where a section of shelving swung open to reveal a hidden cabinet, another of my mother's secrets. Inside were dozens of leather-bound albums I'd never seen before. The first one I opened contained newspaper clippings about Adelaide Mitchell challenging property laws that prevented women from owning businesses without a male cosigner. The second documented my grandmother Elizabeth's efforts to establish a scholarship fund for female artists, a project apparently discontinued after her death. I was deep into the third album when I heard a soft knock. Rebecca stood in the doorway, alone, her usual perfect composure slightly frayed. "May I come in?" I nodded, making space for her on the window seat. She sat, maintaining a careful distance between us. "Daniel's gone to meet with our lawyer," she said, gaze fixed on the garden outside. "Michael thinks we should contest everything immediately." "And you?" She turned the diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist, a gift from our father. On her 30th birthday, I recalled. "I'm not sure." The admission clearly cost her. Rebecca had always been sure of everything, at least on the surface. "Those albums," she said, nodding toward the open cabinet. "What are they?" "Our real family history. The parts that didn't fit Dad's narrative." Rebecca reached for one, opening it carefully. Her breath caught as she saw a photograph of our mother as a young woman, standing proudly beside a small gallery exhibition of her paintings. "I didn't know Mom ever showed her work publicly." "Neither did I admitted. "There's so much we weren't told." Rebecca flipped through more pages, her expression softening with each image. "She was really talented." "Yes," I agreed. "She could have been known for it if she'd been encouraged." Rebecca closed the album, her movements deliberate. "Do you remember when I was 15 and wanted to take that summer art program in New York?" I nodded. Rebecca had shown real promise as a sculptor, creating striking abstract pieces that even our art teacher had praised. "Dad talked me out of it," she continued, her voice carefully neutral. "Said art was fine as a hobby, but not a career path. He suggested the Junior Business Academy instead." I remember. I was so angry with Mom for not defending me, for backing Dad up when he dismissed something I cared about. Rebecca's fingers traced the album's embossed cover. I thought she didn't believe in me either. And now, Rebecca gestured toward the albums. Now I wonder if she was just repeating what had been done to her. We sat in silence for a long moment, the afternoon sun warming the window seat as it had throughout our childhood. When Rebecca spoke again, her voice was different, less polished, more real. "I'm not saying I agree with the will or how Mom went about this, but..." She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Maybe we should look through these albums before we decide anything." It wasn't peace, not yet, but it was an opening, a crack in the wall between us that had seemed impenetrable just hours before. "I'd like that," I said simply. We spent the afternoon together, poring over the documented legacy of Mitchell women. With each album, each letter, each photograph, our understanding of our family shifted. Stories we'd never heard emerged. Adelaide's fight to maintain control of her investments during the Depression. Elizabeth's advocacy for women's financial education in the 1950s. Our own mother's early artistic success, abruptly ended when she married our father. "It's like discovering we're descended from a different family entirely," Rebecca said as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the library floor. "Not different," I corrected gently. "Just more complete." She nodded, closing the bayad. Final album. Michael won't see it that way. To him, this is just about the assets, about who gets what. And to you? Rebecca stood, straightening her skirt in a gesture so reminiscent of our mother that it made my chest ache. I don't know yet, but I'm willing to keep looking. She paused at the door. Don't tell Michael I was here. I need to think before we have that conversation. After she left, I continued exploring the house. Now my house, according to my mother's will. In the music room, I found more hidden documentation. The original deed to Cedar Hill Manor, purchased not by our father as we'd been told, but by Adelaide Mitchell in 1927, using profits from her investments. In my mother's art studio, I discovered a cache of paintings I'd never seen before, vibrant, modernist works nothing like the conventional landscapes she'd shown our father. On the back of each canvas was a small label, "For Sarah, when the time is right." And in my father's study, the final piece fell into place. Hidden behind a false drawer bottom in his desk was a prenuptial agreement between our parents, one that acknowledged the Adelaide Mitchell Trust and guaranteed its separate status from the family's communal assets. The document was signed by both our parents, then apparently hidden away and never referenced again. By midnight, I had assembled all the evidence into a coherent narrative, one that would withstand legal scrutiny when Michael inevitably challenged the will. But beyond the legal case was something more important. The truth about our family, about the women whose voices had been systematically silenced, about the legacy that rightfully belonged to all of us, but especially to the Mitchell daughters. I was making notes about property boundaries when my phone buzzed with a text from Michael. Family meeting tomorrow, 9 a.m. My office, non-negotiable. The commanding tone was so typical that it almost made me smile. Michael still thought he was in charge, that his legal expertise and force of personality would bend reality back to his preferred shape. What he didn't realize was that tomorrow he would be sitting in a building that technically belonged to me. His law office was housed in a property purchased with Adelaide Mitchell trust funds, according to the documentation I'd found. In fact, much of what Michael and Rebecca believed they had built independently had been quietly supported by trust money, channeled through our father in ways designed to obscure its origins. I texted back a simple, "I'll be there," then returned to my research. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 1 a.m. as I finally gathered everything into my mother's old leather portfolio. Whatever happened at tomorrow's meeting, I was prepared. The truth was on my side, and for the first time, I understood exactly what that truth was. As I climbed the stairs to my childhood bedroom, I felt a strange sense of peace. The house around me, its creaking floorboards, its weathered beams, its legacy of strong women, seemed to whisper encouragement. My mother had given me more than property. She'd given me the chance to reclaim a heritage that never should have been hidden. I slept better that night than I had since my parents' deaths, dreaming of women I'd never met but whose blood ran in my veins. Women who had fought for their place in a world that preferred them silent and compliant. In the morning, I dressed, with care, choosing my mother's silver pendant to wear with my simple black dress. The estate agent's appointment had been canceled, but Michael's summons awaited. Whatever strategy he and his lawyers had devised overnight, I would face it with the full weight of truth behind me. As I prepared to leave, I paused in front of the portrait of Adelaide Mitchell that hung in the entrance hall. A stern-faced woman with eyes remarkably like my own. For the first time, I really looked at her expression, recognizing not sternness but determination, not coldness but resolve. I understand now, I whispered to her painted face, and I won't let them bury you again. Mitchell family law offices occupied the entire top floor of a renovated historical building downtown. The receptionist, used to seeing Michael's sisters only at holiday parties and charity functions, did a double take when I asked to be announced. "Sarah Mitchell for the family meeting," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "Of course. Ms. Mitchell," she recovered quickly. "They're waiting for you in the conference room." The walk down the corridor felt longer than usual, each step taking me closer to a confrontation that would redefine our family forever. Through the glass walls, I could see them assembled. Michael at the head of the table, Rebecca and Daniel on one side, and two people I recognized as Michael's senior partners on the other. A display of force. A clear message that I was outnumbered, outranked, and out of my depth. I took a deep breath, adjusted my mother's pendant, and pushed open the door. The conference room fell silent as I entered. 5 pairs of eyes tracked my movement as I walked calmly to the empty chair at the foot of the long mahogany table, directly opposite Michael. I placed my mother's leather portfolio on the polished surface, its worn edges a stark contrast to the sleek modern decor Michael had chosen for his offices. "Thank you for joining us, Sarah," Michael said, his tone suggesting I was late, though I was precisely on time. "I believe you know Harold Winters and Eliza Cortez from our firm's estate division." I nodded to the two lawyers. Harold, in his 60s with steel gray hair and a reputation for ruthless efficiency, had been my father's personal attorney for decades. Eliza was younger, sharper, with the hungry look of someone on the partnership track. Both regarded me with the carefully neutral expressions lawyers reserve for opponents they expect to crush. "Shall we begin?" Michael continued without waiting for my response. "We've reviewed the documents Grace Chen provided, and while they raise some interesting historical points, they don't substantively change our family's current legal position." I sat quietly, making no move to open my portfolio. "Let them show their hand first." Harold cleared his throat. "Ms. Mitchell, while your mother's revised will reflects her personal wishes, it attempts to retroactively recharacterize family assets based on century-old trust provisions that were effectively dissolved when your great-grandmother's estate was settled in 1947. "That's not accurate," I said calmly. Eliza leaned forward. "We have the probate records, Ms. Mitchell. The Adelaide Mitchell Trust was formally closed and its assets distributed to your grandfather." I smiled. "You have the public probate records, not the private agreement that superseded them." Michael's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "What private agreement?" Instead of answering, I turned to Rebecca. She sat stiffly beside Daniel, her expression guarded but not openly hostile as it had been yesterday. Our afternoon among the family albums had left its mark. "Did you tell them about our conversation?" I asked her. Rebecca shifted uncomfortably. "We discussed some of the historical information, yes. But not what you saw, not the documentation." Daniel placed a protective hand over Rebecca's. "We're not here to discuss family memorabilia, Sarah. This is about the legal disposition of substantial assets." "Actually," I said, opening my portfolio at last, "the memorabilia is precisely what matters here." I removed a document protected in an archival sleeve, yellowed with age, but still clearly legible. This is the codicil to Adelaide Mitchell's will, executed privately, and maintained through a separate legal entity specifically to protect female heirs from having their inheritance absorbed by marriage. Harold reached for it, professional interest overcoming his adversarial stance. After scanning it, his expression changed. "This appears authentic, but without the original trust documents." "Which I also have," I interrupted, producing another preserved document. "Along with the chain of succession showing how the trust passed from Adelaide to Elizabeth to my mother, and the private ledgers documenting every property acquired through trust funds, including this building we're sitting in right now." That got their attention. Michael's carefully constructed facade cracked, just slightly. "That's absurd. Dad purchased this building 20 years ago when we expanded the firm." "With a loan secured by Cedar Hill Manor as collateral," I confirmed. "A property that, according to these documents, was never his to leverage. The loan itself was technically fraudulent, though Mom apparently signed off on it to keep the peace." Eliza was rapidly taking notes, her earlier confidence visibly shaken. Harold just looked tired. as if he'd suddenly realized the fight ahead would be much harder than anticipated. "Even if this trust somehow remained valid," Daniel interjected, "surely the statute of limitations doesn't apply," I finished for him. The Adelaide Mitchell Trust was structured as a perpetual entity, with explicit provisions preventing male interference. Any attempt to divert or conceal its assets automatically extended the period during which heirs could reclaim them. I placed another document on the table, a legal opinion from a prominent trust attorney I'd consulted at dawn, confirming my position. Michael picked it up, his lawyer's eyes scanning for weaknesses. "So your position," he said slowly, "is that not only Cedar Hill Manor, but substantial portions of our family's assets, including my law office, technically belong to this resurrected trust that now passes to you?" "Not just to me," I corrected. "According to the trust provisions, the assets are to be managed for the benefit of all female descendants. That includes Rebecca, and any daughters either of us might have in the future." Rebecca's head snapped up. "What?" I turned to her. "The trust was never about excluding men from wealth. It was about ensuring women maintained control over their financial destiny. As the current senior female heir, I would be the trustee, but the benefits flow to all Mitchell women." For the first time since I'd entered, Michael looked genuinely uncertain. The legal landscape he thought he understood was shifting beneath his feet. He exchanged a glance with Harold, who gave a slight, troubled nod. "We'll need time to verify these documents," Michael said, retreating to procedural ground where he felt secure. "Of course," I agreed. "In the meantime, I've instructed Grace to file formal notice with the county recorder's office regarding the trust's claim on all affected properties. Nothing can be sold or further encumbered until this is resolved." Daniel slammed his hand on the table. "This is outrageous. You can't just waltz in here with some ancient paperwork and freeze millions in assets." I met his gaze steadily. "Actually, I can, and I have." The room erupted into arguments. Daniel's outrage, Eliza's rapid-fire questions about documentation, Harold's attempts to suggest compromise positions. Through it all, Rebecca remained silent, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Michael finally raised his hand, commanding silence with the courtroom authority he'd perfected over years of litigation. "Enough. This isn't getting us anywhere." He turned to me, his tone carefully modulated. "Sarah, what exactly do you want out of this?" It was the question I'd been waiting for. The moment when Michael would try to reduce this to a negotiation, a problem to be solved with the right dollar figure. "I want the truth," I said simply. "I want our family history restored. I want the contributions of the Mitchell women acknowledged and respected." "Laudable sentiments," Harold interjected smoothly. "But perhaps we could discuss more concrete terms." I shook my head. "This isn't about terms, Harold. This is about legacy." I reached into my portfolio one last time, removing a large envelope. "These are copies of letters between our mother and Adelaide's last living contemporary, Martin Cooper. He's 94 now, living in the Oak Ridge retirement community, and his mind is still sharp. He's provided a sworn affidavit confirming the private arrangements made to protect the Mitchell women's assets across generations." Michael's face paled slightly. Martin Cooper had been a fixture at family events throughout our childhood. A courtly old man who brought extravagant gifts and always paid special attention to our mother. We'd been told he was a distant cousin, but the truth was apparently more significant. "Martin was Adelaide's lawyer," I continued. "He helped structure the trust specifically to prevent exactly what happened: men taking control of wealth that was designated for women's independence. Dad would never have deliberately," Rebecca began. "I don't know what Dad knew or didn't know," I interrupted gently. "But I do know that our mother felt trapped enough that she spent her final months creating an elaborate plan to restore what had been taken. That should tell us something." The room fell silent. Even Daniel seemed momentarily subdued by the weight of what I was suggesting. Not just a legal technicality, but a generational pattern of erasure that our mother had finally found the courage to break. Michael stood abruptly, buttoning his suit jacket. "I need to consult privately with counsel. Rebecca, Daniel, would you join us? Sarah, please wait here." I nodded, making no move to leave. As they filed out, Rebecca hesitated at the door, looking back at me with an expression that had softened from its earlier hostility. She didn't speak, but the slight nod she gave me carried volumes. Alone in the conference room, I walked to the windows overlooking downtown Oak Ridge. From this height, I could see Cedar Hill Manor in the distance, its Victorian turrets rising above the trees at the edge of town. For the first time, I truly understood what it represented. Not just a home, but a symbol of female resilience across generations. My phone buzzed with a text from Grace Chen. "Notice filed with Recorder's Office. Property freeze confirmed." I smiled. The pieces were falling into place. My mother had laid the groundwork, but it was up to me to follow through, to reclaim not just our inheritance, but our story. The door opened behind me. Rebecca entered alone, closing it carefully behind her. "Michael's furious," she said without preamble. I expected he would be. She joined me at the window, her reflection appearing beside mine in the glass. "Harold's telling him that your documents seem legitimate. That, at minimum, this will take months to sort out in court, with no guarantee of the outcome." I nodded, unsurprised. "And how do you feel about it?" Rebecca was silent for a long moment, gazing out at the town spread below us. Confused, angry, sad. She turned to face me directly. "Why didn't Mom tell us any of this while she was alive? Why the secrecy, the posthumous revelations?" It was a fair question, one I'd asked myself repeatedly since finding the letter. "I think she was trapped in a pattern she couldn't break until Dad was gone," I said slowly. "Their marriage, their entire life together, was built on certain understandings. Challenging those while he was alive would have meant dismantling everything. So she waited until they were both gone and left us to deal with the fallout." Rebecca's voice held a hint of the old bitterness. "How is that fair to any of us?" "It's not," I admitted, "but I don't think she expected to die so suddenly. The documents suggest she was planning to sit down with all of us, to explain everything herself." Rebecca turned back to the window, arms crossed protectively across her chest. "Those albums yesterday? Seeing Mom's paintings? It was like meeting a stranger, someone I might have admired if I'd ever been allowed to know her." "I felt the same way," I said quietly. "Did you know she won a national competition before she married Dad?" Rebecca's voice had softened. "There was a certificate in one of the albums. First place in a juried exhibition at age 23. I shook my head. She never mentioned it. All those times she encouraged my drawing, my sculpting, she never once said she'd been serious about art herself. Rebecca's reflection in the glass showed a vulnerability I rarely saw from my accomplished, polished sister. Why wouldn't she tell me that? Maybe it hurt too much, I suggested, to acknowledge what she'd given up. Rebecca was silent again, processing. When she spoke, her voice had regained some of its usual crisp certainty. Michael wants to fight this, all the way to the Supreme Court if necessary. I expected that too. He's instructed Harold to seek an injunction against the property. Freeze. To argue that Mom was unduly influenced or mentally compromised when she changed her will. I turned to face her directly. Was she? You saw her in those final months. Did she seem confused to you? Manipulated? Rebecca sighed, running a hand through her perfectly styled hair. No. If anything, she seemed more present. More herself than she had in years. I assumed it was because she was finally free from the stress of Dad's illness. Maybe it was more than that, I suggested. Maybe it was freedom to reclaim who she really was. The conference room door opened again, this time admitting Michael and the lawyers. The strain on my brother's face was evident despite his attempt at a neutral expression. "We've discussed the situation," he announced, resuming his seat at the head of the table. "And we're prepared to offer a compromise." I returned to my chair, saying nothing. "The historical significance of these documents is noteworthy," Michael continued carefully. "While we reserve the right to challenge their current legal applicability, we recognize that protracted litigation isn't in anyone's interest." Translation: they weren't confident they'd win in court. Harold took over smoothly. "We propose the following. Cedar Hill Manor remains in the family, with all 3 siblings holding equal ownership. The remaining assets continue as distributed in the original will, but with an additional 10% of liquid assets transferred to Sarah to address the disparity." I almost laughed. They still didn't understand what this was about. "That's not acceptable," I said calmly. Michael's careful composure slipped. "For God's sake, Sarah, we're offering a fair compromise that gives you far more than the original will. What more do you want?" "I want what Mom wanted," I replied. "The restoration of Adelaide's vision, the acknowledgement of our true family legacy." "You're talking about ancient history," Michael exploded. "What does it matter who bought a house 100 years ago?" "It matters because it was deliberately erased," I said, my voice rising to match his. "It matters because generation after generation of Mitchell women were pushed aside, their contributions minimized, their independence undermined. It matters because our mother spent her entire marriage living a half-life, and in her final months, she tried to break that pattern for all of us." Rebecca placed a restraining hand on Michael's arm as he opened his mouth to retort. "Let's all take a breath," she said, her business mediator skills coming to the fore. "Sarah, if the current offer isn't acceptable, what would be?" I laid my hands flat on the table, gathering my thoughts. "I'm not trying to destroy our family or deny either of you your inheritance, but Cedar Hill Manor belongs to the Adelaide Mitchell Trust, along with the other properties purchased with trust funds. That's non-negotiable." Michael started to object, but Rebecca silenced him with a look. "As trustee," I continued, "I would ensure that both of you maintained access to the family home. It would never be sold out from under you, but the legal ownership needs to be restored to its rightful place, under the control of the female line, as Adelaide intended." Harold leaned forward. "And the remaining assets? The investments? The businesses?" "We follow Mom's revised will. Equal division of everything not covered by the trust." I turned to Rebecca. "Including Dad's art collection. I know how much you've always loved Mom's paintings." Something shifted in Rebecca's expression, a softening around the eyes that suggested the gesture had registered. "That's still a substantial reduction in what Michael and Rebecca would receive under the original will," Daniel pointed out, ever focused on the bottom line. "It's what our mother wanted," I said simply, "and it's legally sound." The room fell silent as my siblings absorbed the proposal. Michael's face was tight with suppressed emotion, anger certainly, but perhaps something else too. Rebecca's expression was more contemplative, her gaze distant as if seeing beyond the conference room to something only she could perceive. "We need to discuss this privately," Michael said finally. I nodded, gathering my documents. "I'll wait outside." In the hallway, I leaned against the wall, suddenly exhausted. The adrenaline that had carried me through the confrontation was ebbing, leaving me shaky and uncertain. Had I pushed too hard? Not hard enough? What would my mother have done in my place? The answer came immediately, clear as if she'd whispered it in my ear. She would have stood her ground, just as Adelaide had, just as Elizabeth had in her time. My phone buzzed with a text from Grace. "Martin Cooper asking if you need him to come testify in person. Says he's ready to set the record straight once and for all." I smiled, typing back. "Tell him to stand by. We might need the big guns." The conference room door opened, and Rebecca emerged alone. She closed it behind her, then leaned against it, mirroring my posture against the opposite wall. "Michael's still processing," she said, a diplomatic understatement, if I'd ever heard one. "And you?" Rebecca studied me, her gaze more searching than it had been in years. "I've been thinking about something Mom once told me. I was complaining about a client who wouldn't follow my design recommendations for a property, insisting on changes that would diminish its value. She said, 'Sometimes people can't recognize the worth of what they already have.'" I waited, sensing there was more. "I didn't understand what she meant then," Rebecca continued. "I thought she was talking about the client. Now, I wonder if she was talking about herself, about all of us." "What do you think she meant?" Rebecca pushed away from the door, pacing the small hallway. The Mitchell women had something valuable: independence, agency, control over their own destiny. And gradually they let it slip away because they couldn't recognize its worth. She stopped, facing me directly. "Or because they were convinced it wasn't worth preserving." I nodded, throat tight with sudden emotion. That's what Mom was trying to restore at the end. Not just property or money, but that sense of independent worth. I'm beginning to see that. Rebecca's voice had lost its defensive edge. But Michael, he sees this as a betrayal. Of Dad, of the family as he's always understood it. And what do you see it as? Rebecca was silent for a long moment. "A correction," she said finally. "A restoring of balance that should never have been lost." She straightened, her decision visibly forming. "I'm going to accept your terms." I stared at her, barely daring to believe what I was hearing. "You are?" "Cedar Hill Manor belongs in the Adelaide Mitchell Trust. The paintings, the history, the legacy. It should all be preserved as Mom wanted." A ghost of her usual wry smile appeared. "Besides, I've run the numbers. Even with the revised distribution, we all end up with more than enough." "What about Michael?" Rebecca glanced back at the closed door. "He'll come around, eventually. He doesn't really have a choice. Not with the documentation you've found, and Martin Cooper ready to testify. Better to accept gracefully than lose in court." She held out her hand, a peace offering. "Partners? In preserving what the Mitchell women built?" I took her hand, feeling a connection with my sister that had been missing for years. Partners. When we re-entered the conference room, the atmosphere had shifted. Michael sat alone at the table, the lawyers apparently dismissed. He looked up. As we entered, his expression resigned. "Rebecca's told you her decision?" I nodded, taking my seat. "And yours?" He sighed heavily, the sound of a man accepting defeat. "I won't contest the revised will or the trust documentation. Harold advises that we'd likely lose, and the publicity would damage the firm." He straightened, professional pride reasserting itself. "But I want everything properly documented. A clear agreement about the management of trust properties, access rights, oversight provisions." "Of course," I agreed. "Grace can work with Harold on the details." Michael nodded stiffly, gathering his papers. "I have a client meeting. We can continue this discussion later." After he left, Rebecca and I remained at the table, the tension of the morning giving way to exhausted relief. "He's saving face," Rebecca observed, "but that's as close to surrender as Michael ever gets." "It's enough," I said, feeling the weight of the past few days lift slightly from my shoulders. "We don't need him to be happy about it just to accept it." Rebecca reached across the table, covering my hand with hers. "When did you become so formidable, little sister? All these years, I thought you were just floating through life with your art projects and your quiet ways." I smiled. Maybe I was, just waiting for the right moment, for something worth fighting for. "Cedar Hill Manor?" "Our mother's truth," I corrected. "The truth about all the Mitchell women." Rebecca nodded thoughtfully. "I want to learn more. About Adelaide, Elizabeth, all of them, the parts of our history that got erased. We will, I promised, together. As we left the law offices, walking side by side into the bright midday sun, I felt a profound sense of rightness settle over me. This morning, I had entered that building alone, confronting the combined force of my siblings and their legal arsenal. Now, Rebecca and I moved forward together, united in purpose, if not yet fully reconciled. Cedar Hill Manor awaited us, not as a property to be disposed of, but as the physical embodiment of a legacy finally reclaimed. My mother's revised will had been the key that unlocked a door long sealed shut, but stepping through that door had required a different kind of courage. The Adelaide Mitchell Trust would be restored, with me as its trustee and Rebecca as my partner in preserving its purpose. Michael would adapt, as he always did, to changing circumstances. And the generations of Mitchell women who had built our family's fortune only to see their contributions buried would finally receive their rightful recognition. As we approached my car, Rebecca paused, gazing in the direction of Cedar Hill Manor. "You know what this means, don't you?" I raised an eyebrow, waiting. "The Heritage Festival Committee will have to rewrite their historical plaques." A genuine smile spread across her face. They've been crediting great-grandfather William with founding the Mitchell estate for decades. I laughed, the sound startling, in its unforced joy. "I think it's time for a correction there, too." Rebecca unlocked her car, then hesitated. "There's something in the attic I want to show you. A set of architectural plans I found years ago but could never make sense of. Given what we know now, Adelaide's original vision for the estate," I finished for her, the pieces clicking into place. "Before the changes that made it look more conventionally Victorian." Rebecca nodded. "We should restore it, all of it. Not just the legal ownership, but the physical space too." "I'd like that," I said softly. As she drove away, I remained standing in the parking lot, overwhelmed by the enormity of what had happened. In just 3 days, everything had changed. My relationship with my siblings, my understanding of my family, my place in the world. My phone buzzed with a text from Grace. "Documents being drawn up now. Congratulations, Sarah. Your mother would be so proud." I looked up at the clear blue sky, imagining my mother watching over this unfolding drama. Had she anticipated this outcome when she revised her will? Had she known that Rebecca would ultimately align with me? That Michael would grudgingly concede? Perhaps not the specifics, but she had recognized something essential. That the truth, once revealed, had its own power. That the legacy of the Mitchell women, once unearthed, would command respect simply by virtue of its existence. I texted back to Grace. "Schedule a meeting with Martin Cooper, please. There's more of the story I need to hear." Then I drove to Cedar Hill Manor, not my childhood home now, but the physical embodiment of something larger. A reclaimed legacy, a restored balance, a truth finally set free. The oak trees lining the driveway seemed to welcome me as I approached, their branches forming a canopy that dappled the ground with shifting patterns of light and shadow. As I parked before the grand entrance, I noticed something I'd overlooked before, a small cornerstone partially hidden by ornamental bushes. Kneeling beside it, I brushed away decades of accumulated soil to reveal an inscription, AM 1927, Adelaide Mitchell. The true founder of our family's fortune. The woman whose vision had survived despite every attempt to erase it. "I found you," I whispered, tracing the initials with my fingertip. "And now everyone else will know you too." Martin Cooper's hands trembled slightly as he handled the delicate pages of Adelaide Mitchell's journal, but his eyes remained sharp and clear. At 94, his once imposing frame had shrunk with age, but there was nothing diminished about his mind or his memory. "Adelaide kept meticulous records," he said, his voice carrying the faint remnant of an accent I couldn't quite place. "She knew someday they would be needed." We sat in the solarium of Cedar Hill Manor, afternoon sunlight warming the space through the curved glass ceiling. Rebecca had joined us, her usual business attire replaced by casual slacks and a sweater. Even her posture seemed more relaxed, less defensive than it had been just days ago. "How well did you know her?" I asked Martin, watching as he carefully turned the brittle pages. A smile creased his weathered face. "Very well. I was her legal apprentice when such arrangements were still informal. She couldn't practice openly as a woman, so she worked through male attorneys like my father. But everyone in legal circles knew who was really drafting the briefs." Rebecca leaned forward. "All these years, you knew about the trust? About how Cedar Hill Manor was really acquired?" Martin nodded. "I was sworn to secrecy until the right time came. Your mother and I had an understanding. If she didn't reveal the truth herself before passing, I would help whoever found her journals." He reached for his teacup, those gnarled fingers suddenly steadier. "Eleanor reminded me so much of Adelaide, the same artistic temperament beneath a practical exterior, the same quiet determination." "But Mom gave up her art," Rebecca said, a hint of old bitterness creeping into her voice. "She let it become just a hobby." Martin's bushy white eyebrows rose. "Did she? Or did she simply change her canvas?" He gestured around us at the meticulously decorated solarium, the careful balance of colors and textures. "Your mother's artistic vision shaped every inch of Cedar Hill Manor. She may not have exhibited in galleries, but she created a living masterpiece. I'd never thought of it that way, that my mother's artistic sensibility might have found expression in our home itself rather than just in her paintings. The realization made me see the familiar rooms with new eyes." "Tell us about the trust," I said, steering us back to the matter at hand. "How did it survive when my father took control of the family finances?" Martin set down his teacup carefully. Thomas Mitchell was a brilliant businessman in many ways, but he had a blind spot common to men of his generation. He underestimated the women in his life. He reached into his leather briefcase, removing a folder that looked significantly newer than Adelaide's journals. "Your mother may have appeared to surrender financial control to your father, but she maintained separate records of everything. Every property purchased with Adelaide Mitchell trust funds, every investment made, every dividend received." Rebecca accepted the folder, opening it to reveal spreadsheets and financial records spanning decades, all in our mother's precise handwriting. "She was playing a long game," Martin continued, "allowing your father to believe he controlled everything, while ensuring the documentation existed to reclaim it when necessary." "But why wait?" Rebecca asked, the question that had been troubling her since our confrontation with Michael. "Why not assert her rights while she was alive?" Martin's expression softened. "Your mother loved your father deeply, despite their differences. She believed challenging him openly would destroy their marriage. She chose compromise, perhaps too much compromise, to keep peace." "Until Dad was diagnosed," I said quietly. "And she realized time was running out." Martin nodded. "Thomas's illness was the catalyst. Eleanor finally understood she needed to act if she wanted to restore the Mitchell women's legacy." Rebecca traced her finger over our mother's handwriting. "She must have felt so alone, keeping all this to herself for decades." "Not entirely alone," Martin corrected gently. "She had me and Grace Chen, a small circle of confidants who understood what she was trying to preserve. The revelation that our mother had maintained this secret life, this hidden purpose, for all the years we'd known her was still difficult to absorb. I thought of her in her studio, painting landscapes that seemed conventional on the surface but contained hidden depths if you knew where to look." Martin turned to a specific page in Adelaide's journal. "You should read this. It's Adelaide's letter to future generations of Mitchell women." I accepted the journal carefully, recognizing the weight of both history and responsibility in my hands. The handwriting was different from my mother's, bolder, less constrained by convention, but there was a similar energy to it, a sense of purpose that transcended time. "My dearest descendants," I read aloud, "if you are reading this, then the trust has served its purpose, to preserve independence for Mitchell women across generations, regardless of society's expectations or men's ambitions. This house is more than wood and stone. It is a sanctuary, a female autonomy in a world determined to deny it. Guard it well. Remember that wealth is merely a tool for freedom, and freedom must never be surrendered, only shared with those who honor its value." The words resonated through the solarium, seeming to vibrate in the air long after I finished reading. Rebecca's eyes shone with unshed tears, and even Martin seemed moved despite his familiarity with the text. "She was extraordinary," Rebecca said softly. "As was your mother," Martin replied, "and as are you both, in your own ways." The doorbell chimed, breaking the moment. Neither Rebecca nor I moved immediately, reluctant to leave this bubble of newfound understanding. "That would be Michael," Martin said, checking his watch. I asked him to join us. "It's time all three of you heard the complete story." I exchanged a surprised glance with Rebecca. After our confrontation at his office, Michael had retreated into chilly formality, communicating only through his lawyers as we finalized the restoration of the Adelaide Mitchell Trust. "Does he know you invited us too?" Rebecca asked. Martin's eyes twinkled. "Let's call it a strategic omission." I went to answer the door, finding Michael on the threshold looking impeccable as always in a tailored suit despite it being Saturday. His expression froze when he saw me. "Sarah? What are you doing here?" "I live here now," I reminded him gently. "Martin invited us all to meet." Michael's jaw tightened, but he stepped inside, removing his coat with precise movements that betrayed his discomfort. "I wasn't aware this would be a family gathering. Martin thought it was important for all of us to hear the full story together." I led him toward the solarium, noting how he scanned the entrance hall as if cataloging changes. In truth, I'd altered very little since taking possession, but his scrutiny suggested he expected to find Cedar Hill Manor transformed in his absence. When we entered the solarium, Michael's professional mask slipped momentarily at the sight of Rebecca sitting comfortably beside Martin, leather-bound journals spread across the table between them. "Rebecca, I thought you were meeting clients today." She shrugged, a casual gesture so unlike her usual controlled movements that Michael blinked in surprise. This seemed more important. Martin rose shakily to his feet, extending a hand to Michael. "Thank you for coming, young man. Please join us." The young man designation, accurate from Martin's nonagenarian perspective, but amusingly applied to my 50-year-old brother, seemed to throw Michael further off balance. He shook Martin's hand automatically before taking the seat furthest from Rebecca and me. "I understand you've been reviewing some old family documents," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "More than reviewing," Martin replied, resuming his seat with a slight wince that reminded me of his arthritic joints. "I've been filling in gaps in your family's history, gaps that were deliberately created." Michael's expression remained guarded. "By our father, you mean?" "By generations of Mitchell men," Martin corrected gently. "Your father continued a pattern established long before his birth." Rebecca leaned forward. "Michael, you need to see these journals. They change everything. We thought we knew about our family." "I've seen the legal documentation," Michael replied stiffly. "My attorneys have acknowledged their validity. What more is there to discuss?" Martin opened another journal, this one bound in dark green leather. "Perhaps you'd be interested in William Mitchell's own words regarding his marriage to Adelaide." He adjusted his reading glasses and began to recite from the page. "Adelaide's financial acumen continues to astonish. While my colleagues lose fortunes in this wretched depression, her investments grow steadily. She insists on maintaining separate accounts despite my objections, claiming women must preserve independence even in marriage." It galls me to admit she was right to do so, as my own ventures falter. Were it not for her foresight, we might have lost everything in the crash. Martin looked up, meeting Michael's gaze directly. Your great-grandfather wrote this in 1934, during the depths of the Depression. The Mitchell fortune didn't just survive those years, it grew, thanks to Adelaide's investment strategy. Michael shifted in his seat. That's interesting historical context, but there's more, Martin interrupted, turning to another marked page. This is from 1940. Adelaide has purchased a property on Highland Avenue against my explicit wishes. Claims it will be the new family home, more befitting our station. I told her such decisions are the husband's province, but she simply smiled. That infuriating smile, and reminded me that her money bought it, not mine. The woman is impossible to govern, yet I cannot help but admire her vision. The house, Cedar Hill Manor, she calls it, will indeed make a statement. The solarium fell, silent as the words settled around us. Michael's expression had shifted from polite disinterest to reluctant fascination. Everything we were told about our family's success was a carefully edited version of the truth, I said quietly. Great-grandfather William didn't build the Mitchells. Fortune through his business acumen. Adelaide did, while he took the public credit. And the pattern repeated with each generation, Rebecca added. The women's contributions erased or minimized, the men's elevated and celebrated. Michael ran a hand over his face, his usual composure cracking further. Why are you showing me this now? The legal questions are settled. The trust has been restored. What more do you want from me? Martin set the journal down carefully. Understanding? Michael, acknowledgement. The restoration of truth that's been buried for too long. And what am I supposed to do with this truth? Michael demanded, an edge of genuine distress in his voice. Reject everything Dad taught me? Dismiss his legacy entirely? No, I said, moving to sit closer to him. But maybe reconsider it. See it in a more complete light. Rebecca joined us, creating a triangle that felt both confrontational and intimate. Dad wasn't a villain, Michael. He was a product of his upbringing, just as his father was before him. But that doesn't mean we have to perpetuate the pattern. Michael stared at the journals spread across the table, tangible evidence of a history he'd never known. Dad always said the Mitchell's success came from making hard decisions, from putting business before sentiment. And Adelaide would say it came from recognizing value where others didn't. From investing in the future, rather, than clinging to the past, Martin countered. Both perspectives have merit. Neither is the complete story. Something shifted in Michael's expression. Not surrender exactly, but a willingness to consider possibilities he'd previously rejected. I always wondered why Mom insisted I read to her from the business section every morning when I was a teenager. I thought she was just being supportive of my interests. Martin chuckled. Eleanor understood markets better than most professional investors. She just allowed Thomas to believe she was deferring to his expertise. How could she live like that? Michael asked, genuine bewilderment in his voice. Hiding her intelligence? Her capabilities? Love makes us accept imperfect arrangements, Martin said, his gaze distant with memory. And your mother did love your father, despite everything. Rebecca reached for another album, opening it to a photograph I hadn't seen before. Our parents on their wedding day, looking impossibly young and hopeful. I think she believed she could change things gradually, from within. That eventually Dad would recognize her as an equal partner. Did he ever? Michael asked softly. Martin shook his head. Not in the way she hoped. Thomas was a man of strong convictions, including very traditional ideas about marriage and family. Eleanor adapted to that reality while creating spaces of independence where she could. Her art studio, I murmured. The charity foundation she managed, Rebecca added. The investment portfolio she maintained separately from the family accounts, Martin finished. Small kingdoms where she could rule unchallenged. Michael was silent for a long moment, absorbing this radically different perspective on our family dynamics. When he finally spoke, his voice held a note of vulnerability I rarely heard from my supremely confident brother. Why didn't she trust me with this? I would have listened. The question hung in the air, laden with hurt that surprised me with its rawness. Martin glanced at Rebecca and me, silently deferring to us. I think, I began carefully, that Mom saw how completely you'd embraced Dad's worldview. How successful you'd become by following his example. Maybe she was afraid challenging that would seem like she was challenging you. Rebecca nodded. You were always Dad's son, Michael. His perfect successor. Questioning his version of our family history would have felt like questioning everything you'd built your identity around. Michael didn't deny it. He reached for Adelaide's journal, turning the pages with newfound respect for their fragility. I would have adapted, he said, so quietly I almost didn't hear him. If I'd known. The admission seemed to cost him something. A crack in the facade of certainty he'd maintained throughout his adult life. Martin checked his watch again. I have one more piece of evidence to share with you all. Something Eleanor entrusted to me shortly before her death. He withdrew a small USB drive from his pocket. She recorded a video message for the three of you. She asked that I deliver it only after the trust had been restored and you had all gathered together at Cedar Hill Manor. The room fell silent as I retrieved my laptop from the study. When I returned, Michael and Rebecca had moved to sit side by side on the sofa, their usual careful distance abandoned. I placed the computer on the coffee table, inserting the drive with fingers that suddenly trembled. A video file appeared, dated just 3 weeks before our mother's unexpected death. I clicked play, and her face filled the screen. She looked more vibrant than I remembered from those final months. Her silver hair styled elegantly, her blue eyes, so like Rebecca's, clear and focused. She sat in her art studio, surrounded by canvases we'd never seen, more modern and expressive than the conventional landscapes that hung in the main house. My dear children, she began, her voice steady and warm. If you're watching this, then the truth has finally come to light. Martin has fulfilled his promise, and Sarah has found what I left for her to find. She paused, seeming to look directly at each of us through the screen. I owe you an explanation, and an apology. The explanation is simple. I've spent decades allowing a false narrative about our family to persist, partly out of love for your father, partly out of fear of disrupting the life we'd built together. The apology is more complicated. She leaned closer to the camera. Michael, I'm sorry I didn't challenge your father's teachings more directly. I watched you absorb his values, his strengths and his blindnesses, without offering you the balance you deserved. You've built an impressive career by following his example, but perhaps at the cost of a more nuanced understanding of worth and legacy. Michael's expression remained carefully controlled, but I saw his hands tighten around the armrest. Rebecca, our mother continued, I'm sorry I didn't fight harder when your artistic talents were redirected toward practical pursuits. I told myself I was protecting you from my own disappointments, but in truth, I was taking the path of least resistance. You've achieved remarkable success on your chosen path, but I wonder sometimes what might have flourished if I'd defended your early passions more fiercely. Rebecca blinked rapidly, her professional composure momentarily abandoned. And Sarah. Mom's gaze seemed to find me specifically. I'm sorry for the burden I've placed on you. Finding these truths, confronting your siblings with them, it's an unfair responsibility. But of my 3 children, you were the one who always saw beyond the surface, who questioned the stories we told ourselves as a family. I knew you would have the courage to restore what had been lost, even at the cost of temporary harmony. She sat back, her expression softening. What I hope, more than anything, is that this revelation brings you closer rather than driving you apart. The Mitchell legacy isn't just about property or wealth, it's about resilience, about finding balance between practicality and passion, between individual ambition and family unity. Mom reached for something off-screen, bringing into view a small wooden box I recognized from her dresser. Inside this box, which Sarah will find in my studio cabinet, are 3 keys. They open a safe deposit box at Oak Ridge National Bank containing letters I've written to each of you, sharing the specific hopes and dreams I've held for your futures. They are not instructions or demands, simply the thoughts of a mother who has watched her children grow with pride, even when she disagreed with their choices or her own role in shaping them. She smiled, a full, genuine expression that made her look years younger. Cedar Hill Manor belongs to all of you in different ways. Michael, your logical mind appreciated its investment value and historical significance. Rebecca, your designer's eye recognized the harmony of its spaces and the careful intention behind each element. Sarah, your artist's soul connected with the stories embedded in its walls and the generations it has sheltered. Mom's expression grew serious again. The Adelaide Mitchell Trust exists to protect more than property. It protects the principle that women's contributions should not be erased, that their autonomy should not be compromised, that their visions deserve to be realized. Honor that principle, even as you find your own ways to interpret it for a new era. She looked down briefly, composing herself. I had hoped to have this conversation in person, to answer your questions and help you process this significant shift in your understanding of our family. Since I cannot do that, I ask that you be gentle with each other through this transition. The truth can be painful, but it can also heal wounds you didn't know you carried. Mom raised her hand in a small wave, her wedding ring catching the light. I love you all, exactly as you are, while believing you can become even more. The Mitchell story isn't finished. It's merely entering a new chapter, one where all voices contribute to its telling. The screen went dark, leaving us in silence broken only by the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Rebecca was crying openly now, tears tracking silently down her cheeks. Michael sat completely still, his lawyer's composure finally shattered by our mother's gentle indictment. I moved first, going to the cabinet she had indicated in the video. The wooden box sat exactly where she'd described, containing 3 small keys on individual rings, each with our initials engraved on the attached tags. I brought them back to the sofa, holding them out in my palm. Rebecca took hers immediately, closing her fingers around it as if it were something precious. Michael hesitated longer before finally accepting his, studying the engraved MM with an unreadable expression. I never really knew her, he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. None of us did, Rebecca replied, wiping tears with the back of her hand. Not completely. But we can know her now, I said quietly. Through her journals, her paintings, the truths she preserved for us to find. Martin had been silent during the video and its aftermath, a respectful witness to our family's reckoning. Now he cleared his throat gently. Eleanor hoped the 3 of you would find a way forward together, he said. Different roles, perhaps, but unified in purpose. Michael stood abruptly, moving to the solarium windows that overlooked the gardens our mother had designed. His reflection in the glass showed an expression I'd rarely seen on my confident, controlled brother's face. Uncertainty, even vulnerability. I need time, he said finally, turning back to face us. To process all of this. To reconsider certain assumptions. It wasn't acceptance, not yet. But it was an opening, a willingness to question the narrative he'd built his life around. For Michael, that represented a seismic shift. Take whatever time you need, I said. Cedar Hill Manor isn't going anywhere. Neither is the Adelaide Mitchell Trust. He nodded stiffly, gathering his coat. I'll review Mother's letter. Then perhaps we can discuss next steps. He paused at the doorway. The family archives at my office. There may be additional documentation relevant to this Revised history. I'll have them sent over. After he left, Rebecca and I helped Martin gather the journals and photographs, handling each with the reverence they deserved. The elderly lawyer seemed tired but satisfied, like a man who had completed a decades-long obligation. Will he accept it, do you think? Rebecca asked as we walked Martin to his car. In his own time, in his own way, Martin replied. Michael is very much his father's son, but he has elements of Eleanor in him too, a capacity for growth that Thomas sometimes lacked. After Martin departed, Rebecca and I returned to the parlor, emotionally exhausted but somehow lighter than before. She curled into a corner of the sofa, looking more relaxed in our family home than I could remember seeing her in years. What? Now? She asked, twirling her key between her fingers. I sat across from her, considering the question. We restore what was lost, not just legally, but completeness. The full story of the Mitchell women, acknowledged and celebrated. Starting with Adelaide? I nodded. The Oak Ridge Historical Society has those plaques to correct, remember? A smile spread across Rebecca's face. Not her polished professional smile, but something more genuine. I happened to sit on their board of directors. I think we could arrange a special exhibition for this year's Heritage Festival. The Mitchell Women, Uncovering Oak Ridge's Hidden History. Mom would have loved that. Yes, Rebecca agreed softly. She would have. We sat in companionable silence as evening shadows lengthened across the parlor. Outside, the gardens our mother had designed bloomed with early summer flowers, their colors deepening in the golden. Our light. Do you think we'll ever fully understand her? Rebecca asked finally. Why she made the choices she did. I considered this, thinking of the journals we'd discovered, the video message, the letters waiting for us at the bank. I think we'll understand her better than we did before. Maybe that's enough. Rebecca nodded, then stood decisively. I should go. Daniel's expecting me for dinner. She hesitated, then added, Unless... Would you like to join us? I know it's short notice, but I'd like that, I said, surprised by the invitation and my own quick acceptance of it. As we walked to the door, Rebecca paused in the entrance hall, looking up at the portrait of Adelaide Mitchell that had always hung there. A woman we'd been taught to see as merely great-grandmother rather than the architect of our family's fortune. She's really quite extraordinary, isn't she? Rebecca said, studying the determined expression, the direct gaze that seemed to challenge the viewer across decades. I can't believe I never really looked at her before. We see what we're taught to see, I replied, until something shakes us awake. Rebecca squeezed my hand briefly, a gesture so unexpected from my usually reserved sister that it momentarily stunned me. Thank you, she said quietly, for being stubborn enough to find the truth. After she left, I remained in the entrance hall, looking up at Adelaide's portrait in the fading light. We found you, I whispered, echoing the words I'd spoken at her cornerstone. And we won't let you be forgotten again. The house settled around me, its familiar creaks and sighs now carrying new meaning. This wasn't just a property that had narrowly escaped being sold to developers. It was the physical embodiment of a legacy preserved against considerable odds by Adelaide's foresight, by my mother's quiet determination, and finally, by my own refusal to accept the story as it had been told to us. Tomorrow would bring practical matters, bank visits to retrieve our mother's letters, discussions with the Historical Society, continuing negotiations with Michael through his attorneys. But tonight, in the gathering darkness of the home that had sheltered generations of Mitchell women, I allowed myself to simply exist in the moment of victory. Not the triumph of battle that leaves destruction in its wake, but the deeper satisfaction of restoration, of bringing light to what had been deliberately obscured, of giving voice to those who had been silenced. Adelaide Mitchell had created a trust to protect female autonomy across generations. My mother had preserved that trust through decades of compromise until she could finally restore it. And now, the responsibility passed to me, not just to maintain legal ownership of properties, but to ensure that the principle behind that ownership remained alive and vital. As I climbed the stairs to my mother's studio, determined to examine her hidden paintings more carefully, I felt the weight of that responsibility balanced by a newfound sense of connection. To my mother, to Adelaide, to the lineage of Mitchell, women who had maintained their independence even when it couldn't be openly claimed. The confrontation with my siblings had been necessary, painful, and ultimately transformative. What had begun as a battle over property had evolved into something far more significant: the reclamation of our family's true story, with all its complexity, its contradictions, and its quiet acts of resistance. Cedar Hill Manor stood as it had for nearly a century, but the narrative it embodied had been fundamentally altered. And in that alteration lay the possibility of healing, not just for the three of us who had gathered today in the solarium, but for the generations of Mitchells, yet to come, who would now inherit a more complete understanding of their legacy. The Heritage Festival of Oak Ridge had transformed the town square into a celebration of local history. White tents lined the perimeter, each dedicated to a different aspect of the community's past. Children chased each other across the grass, while parents examined historical exhibits and elderly residents pointed out familiar faces in enlarged black and white photographs. I stood before the newly installed centerpiece display, The Mitchell Women, Reclaiming Oak Ridge's Hidden Legacy. The exhibit had drawn steady crowds all morning, visitors lingering over Adelaide's journals, Eleanor's paintings, and the newly unearthed photographs showing 4 generations of Mitchell women. "Quite the turnout," Grace Chen said, appearing beside me. She'd become a frequent visitor to Cedar Hill Manor over the past 3 months as we worked to properly document the Adelaide Mitchell Trust. Today, she looked less like a lawyer and more like a friend, dressed casually for the festival, in slacks and a light sweater. "I never expected this level of interest," I admitted, watching as another group gathered before the timeline we'd created, tracing Adelaide's financial acumen through the Depression and beyond. "People love having their understanding of history challenged," Grace replied, "especially when the new version is more interesting than the old one." She was right. The story of Adelaide Mitchell, immigrant's daughter turned financial strategist who built a fortune while allowing her husband to take the credit, had captivated Oak Ridge in a way that surprised even Rebecca, who had initially worried the NAM exhibition might be seen as diminishing our grandfather's contributions. Instead, the community had embraced this more complex narrative, particularly the women who recognized echoes of their own family dynamics in Adelaide's story. Several had come forward with similar hidden histories, grandmothers and great-aunts, whose business acumen or artistic talents had been downplayed or erased entirely from family lore. "Where's Rebecca?" Grace asked, scanning the crowded square. "Leading a tour of the Historical Society members. She's become quite the Adelaide Mitchell expert." Grace smiled. "And Michael?" I hesitated. My brother's journey to acceptance had been neither simple nor linear. After our mother's video message, he had retreated into weeks of silence, processing the fundamental shift in his understanding of our family. When he finally reached out, it was through formal, carefully worded emails requesting specific documentation or clarifying legal points. "He's coming later," I said, "for the dedication ceremony." Grace squeezed my arm sympathetically. "That's progress." It was. 3 months ago, Michael wouldn't have attended at all. The fact that he had agreed to be present when the new historical marker was unveiled, one that properly credited Adelaide Mitchell as the original purchaser of Cedar Hill Manor, represented a significant evolution in his thinking. I made my way through the festival, stopping occasionally to answer questions from curious townspeople. Many had known our family for generations, but were only now learning about the women who had shaped its fortunes from behind the scenes. Near the refreshment tent, I spotted Daniel, deep in conversation with the mayor. My brother-in-law had undergone his own transformation since the will's revelation. Initially hostile to what he saw as an attack on the family structure, he had gradually come to appreciate the historical significance of what we'd uncovered. It probably helped that Rebecca had decided to use some of her inheritance to fund a scholarship for female business students, a decision that aligned with Daniel's values while honoring Adelaide's legacy. "Sarah!" Rebecca waved from across the square, extricating herself from a group of festival attendees to join me. "The Historical Society president wants to discuss making this a permanent exhibit at the museum. Can you believe it?" She looked different these days, still polished and professional, but somehow lighter, less rigidly controlled. The change had begun after she read our mother's personal letter, retrieved from the bank vault the day after we watched the video message. Rebecca had never shared its exact contents with me, but whatever Eleanor had written had catalyzed something in my sister. "Adelaide would have approved," I replied, linking my arm through hers as we walked toward the main stage where the dedication ceremony would take place. Though she might have been shocked to see her private journals on public display. Rebecca laughed. "I don't know. From what Martin tells us about her, she might have enjoyed the recognition, even if it came decades late." Martin Cooper had become a regular fixture at Cedar Hill Manor, filling in the gaps in our knowledge with his first-hand recollections of Adelaide in her later years. At 94, his memory for detail remained remarkable, particularly when it came to Adelaide's business strategies and her constant battle to maintain control of her assets in an era when married women had few legal rights. "Speaking of recognition," Rebecca continued, "have you seen the article in the Oak Ridge Gazette? They're calling us the inheritors of Adelaide's vision and suggesting we might shake up the local business community just as she did." I smiled. "I'm not sure organizing a historical exhibition qualifies as shaking up the business community." "Maybe not," Rebecca conceded. "But what about your plans for the Cedar Hill Foundation?" She had a point. Using funds from the restored trust, I had begun establishing a foundation to support female artists and entrepreneurs, a modern extension of the principles Adelaide had fought for. The initial response had been overwhelming, with applications flooding in from women throughout the region seeking the kind of support that had been historically difficult for them to access. "It's a start," I acknowledged as we neared the stage. Martin was already seated in the front row, looking distinguished in a suit that had probably been tailored decades ago. Beside him was an empty chair reserved for Michael, who had yet to arrive. Rebecca checked her watch. "He promised he'd be here." "He will," I said, with more confidence than I felt. Michael had been making efforts, but his natural inclination was still to avoid situations that challenged his worldview too directly. As if summoned by our concern, a familiar figure appeared at the edge of the square. Michael walked purposefully toward us, dressed in his usual impeccable suit despite the festival's casual atmosphere. What was unusual was the woman beside him, his daughter Emily, who had been studying abroad when our family drama unfolded and had only recently returned to Oak Ridge. "Uncle Michael actually brought Emily," Rebecca whispered, sounding as surprised as I felt. "That's significant." It was. Michael had always been grooming his daughter to follow in his footsteps, steering her toward law school and eventually partnership in the family firm. By bringing her to this celebration of the Mitchell women's legacy, he was acknowledging that her understanding of our family history needed to be more complete than his had been. "Sarah, Rebecca," Michael greeted, us with a formal nod that couldn't quite conceal his discomfort. "Emily wanted to see the exhibition before the ceremony." My niece, a striking young woman with her father's sharp features softened by her mother's warmth, hugged us both. "Dad's been telling me about great-great-grandmother Adelaide," she said. "Is it true she once outbid a group of male investors for a commercial property while pretending to be her husband's secretary?" I laughed, recognizing one of Martin's favorite anecdotes. "Apparently so. Martin has all the best stories. You should ask him about the time Adelaide manipulated the school board into allowing girls to take mathematics classes." Emily's eyes lit up. I definitely will. She glanced at her father. Dad said I should read all the journals before I decide on my final thesis topic for senior year. Michael cleared his throat. I merely suggested that understanding our complete family history might provide context for her academic choices. Rebecca and I exchanged surprised glances. This was new territory for Michael, acknowledging that Adelaide's story might be relevant to his daughter's education. The ceremony starts in 15 minutes, Rebecca said, checking her watch again. Emily, would you like a quick tour of the exhibition first? I can show you the original deed to Cedar Hill Manor. As they walked away, I found myself alone with Michael for the first time since the revelation of our mother's video message. The awkwardness between us had not fully dissipated, but it had evolved into something more thoughtful, less hostile. Thank you for coming, I said simply. Michael adjusted his tie, a nervous gesture I recognized from childhood. Emily insisted, once she learned about the exhibition, she's quite enthusiastic about discovering this side of our family history. She takes after Adelaide in that way. Martin says she had the same intensity about new ideas. Michael almost smiled. So I've been told. He hesitated, then added, I've been reading Mother's journals from her college years, before she met Dad. This admission surprised me. Michael had accepted the legal reality of the revised will and trust documents, but he had shown little interest in the personal writings that Rebecca and I had been poring over. What do you think? I asked carefully. He gazed across the square at the festival attendees examining our family's newly revealed history. She was different than I thought. More ambitious, more independent-minded. He paused. She wanted to study economics. Did you know that? Not art history as we were always told. I nodded. It's in her letter to me. She switched majors after meeting Dad because he thought art history was more suitable for a woman who planned to be primarily a homemaker. Michael winced slightly. When Emily told me she was considering changing from pre-law to economics, my first instinct was to discourage her, to point out how a law degree would better serve her long-term career goals. He met my gaze directly. I caught myself using almost exactly the same words Dad used whenever anyone challenged his vision of the proper path. It was the most personal thing Michael had shared in months, perhaps years. This acknowledgement of the patterns he was breaking represented more progress than any legal concession. What did you tell her instead? I asked. That she should make the decision based on her genuine interests, not family expectations. He straightened his shoulders, as if the admission had cost him something. And that the Mitchell tradition of financial acumen clearly ran through the female line, so economics might be entirely appropriate. Before I could respond, the town mayor approached the microphone, signaling the start of the dedication ceremony. Michael and I took our seats in the front row, joining Rebecca, Emily, and Martin. Distinguished guests, citizens of Oak Ridge, the mayor began, today we gather to correct a historical oversight and acknowledge the true history of one of our community's most prominent families. As she spoke about Adelaide's contributions to Oak Ridge during the Depression, the jobs preserved by her strategic investments, the charitable foundation she established anonymously, I watched Michael's face. His expression remained carefully neutral, but I could see him absorbing this public acknowledgement of a truth he had spent months coming to terms with privately. The mayor invited us to the stage for the unveiling of the new historical marker that would stand at the entrance to Cedar Hill Manor. Rebecca took one side of the covering cloth, while I took the other. After a brief hesitation, Michael joined us, standing between his sisters in a show of family unity that felt both symbolic and genuine. As we pulled away the covering to reveal the bronze plaque with its new text crediting Adelaide Mitchell as the original purchaser and visionary behind Cedar Hill Manor, applause rippled through the crowd. Emily whistled sharply from the front row, earning a mixture of amusement and approval from the surrounding attendees. The ceremony concluded with Martin Cooper sharing a few personal recollections of Adelaide: her sharp wit, her financial foresight, her determination to create opportunities for women even when society actively discouraged such efforts. At 94, his voice sometimes wavered, but the clarity of his memories captivated the audience. Adelaide once told me, he concluded, that wealth was meaningless unless it created freedom, not just for oneself but for others. The Mitchell family's newly established foundation for women in business and the arts represents the continuation of that vision, adapted for a new century but faithful to its original purpose. Adelaide would be proud to see her great-granddaughters and great-great-granddaughter carrying forward her legacy. The pointed inclusion of Emily in this statement drew all eyes to Michael's daughter, who sat straighter under the attention. Michael himself appeared momentarily startled, then thoughtful, as if considering his daughter's place in this matrilineal legacy for the first time. After the ceremony, festival attendees dispersed to enjoy the various historical exhibits and food vendors. The four of us, Michael, Rebecca, Emily, and I, found ourselves standing somewhat awkwardly near the Mitchell display. "I should get back to the office," Michael said predictably. "I have a conference call at 3. Emily rolled her eyes with affectionate exasperation. "Dad, it's Saturday, and Grandma's letter specifically said you work too much." This casual reference to Eleanor's private letter to Michael, something he had never discussed with either Rebecca or me, created a moment of startled silence. Michael adjusted his cuffs, a nervous tell. "Mother may have had a point about work-life balance," he admitted reluctantly, "which is why I thought perhaps we might all have dinner at Cedar Hill Manor tonight, if Sarah is amenable." The invitation caught me completely by surprise. Since the revelation of the revised will, Michael had maintained a careful distance from Cedar Hill Manor, conducting necessary business through lawyers and avoiding family gatherings at what he still sometimes called the house, rather than home. "Of course," I said quickly before he could reconsider. "I'd love that." "Excellent," Emily clapped her hands. "I've been dying to see inside ever since Dad told me about the hidden compartments in the library where great-grandma Adelaide kept her financial records." Rebecca laughed. "Wait until you see the secret panel in the music room. Sarah found stock certificates from the 1930s hidden inside the piano bench." As Emily peppered us with questions about other hidden treasures, Michael stepped away to take a call. When he returned, his expression had shifted from businesslike to almost apologetic. "That was Harold," he said, naming his senior partner. "He's located another cache of documents in the firm's archives. Correspondence between our grandfather and Adelaide's brother regarding the Mitchell investments. It appears grandfather was more aware of Adelaide's role than we realized. He actively collaborated with her while maintaining the public fiction that he was the financial strategist in the family. This revelation, that our great-grandfather had been a willing participant in the arrangement, rather than simply taking credit for his wife's work, added yet another layer of complexity to our family history. Why maintain the pretense if they were actually partners? Emily asked, demonstrating the sharp analytical mind that had made her the top student in her class. Social expectations, Martin answered, joining our circle with the careful movements of his age. William Mitchell was a prominent businessman. Acknowledging his wife as the financial genius behind their success would have damaged his standing among his peers and potentially harmed their business interests. So it was a strategic decision, Emily concluded, a partnership that couldn't be publicly acknowledged because of the times they lived in. Precisely, Martin confirmed. Adelaide understood the realities of her era. She was willing to work behind the scenes because it allowed her the freedom to pursue her financial strategies without the constraints that would have been imposed on her as a visible female investor. Michael was listening with unusual attentiveness, his lawyer's mind visibly reassessing facts in light of new evidence. The letters Harold found suggest grandfather actually valued Adelaide's financial judgment above his own. He implemented her recommendations even when his colleagues advised against them. That's not the story we were told growing up, Rebecca said quietly. No, Michael agreed. It's not. The simple acknowledgement represented months of internal struggle for my brother. The gradual dismantling of a family narrative he had not only believed but built his identity around. I've been thinking, he continued hesitantly, about how to incorporate this more complete history into the firm's founding story. We've always emphasized William Mitchell's legal acumen as the foundation of Mitchell family law, but Adelaide's financial strategies were equally important to our early success. Emily brightened. Dad, what if we created a scholarship? The Adelaide Mitchell Scholarship for women pursuing combined law and business degrees. The suggestion, aligning perfectly with both Michael's professional values and Adelaide's legacy, visibly resonated with him. That's actually an excellent idea. We could announce it at the firm's centennial celebration next month. Rebecca caught my eye, her expression reflecting my own amazement at this evolution in our brother's thinking. 3 months ago, Michael had been prepared to fight the revised will all the way to the Supreme Court. Now he was contemplating how to honor Adelaide's legacy through his law practice. I think that sounds wonderful, I said sincerely. A fitting tribute to both our legal and financial family traditions. As we continued discussing possibilities for the scholarship, I noticed a subtle shift in our family dynamic. The rigid hierarchy that had defined our relationships for decades, Michael as the authoritative older brother, Rebecca as the practical middle sibling, me as the dreamy youngest, had given way to something more balanced. We were learning to see each other as individuals with unique contributions rather than fixed roles in an unchanging family system. Michael checked his watch again, but this time it wasn't an excuse to escape. Shall we say 6 o'clock for dinner? I need to review those letters before Harold locks up the office for the weekend. Perfect, I agreed. I'll make Mom's roast chicken recipe. With the lemon and herbs? Emily asked hopefully. Exactly as she used to make it, I promised. As Michael and Emily departed, Rebecca and I found ourselves alone before the exhibition display. A photograph of our mother as a young woman, standing proudly beside one of her early paintings, had drawn a small crowd of admirers. I've been thinking about applying to that evening art program at the community college, Rebecca said suddenly, just to see if I still have any of the talent Mom always said I had. The admission clearly cost her something, an acknowledgement of vulnerability from my supremely confident sister. I think that's a wonderful idea, I said. Mom would be thrilled. Rebecca touched our mother's image gently. I keep wondering what she'd think of all this. The exhibition, the foundation, Michael actually acknowledging Adelaide's importance. I think she'd be amazed, I replied honestly. Remember how carefully she hid those journals, those paintings? She never expected them to be publicly celebrated like this. No, Rebecca agreed. She was working within the constraints she understood, just like Adelaide did, creating whatever spaces for truth she could manage without toppling the entire structure. We stood in companionable silence, watching festival attendees engage with our family's newly revealed history. Children pointed excitedly at Adelaide's photograph. Elderly visitors nodded in recognition of patterns they'd seen in their own families. Young women lingered over the financial records that demonstrated Adelaide's remarkable acumen during an era when women weren't even permitted to open bank accounts without male permission. You know, Rebecca said thoughtfully, I always assumed we'd sell Cedar Hill Manor after Mom and Dad were gone, that we'd divide the proceeds and go our separate ways, maintaining the obligatory holiday gatherings but otherwise leading entirely independent lives. And now? She smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes, not the polished professional expression she had perfected for business settings. Now I can't imagine letting it go. It's not just a house anymore. It's a repository of truth, place where our family's complete story is finally being told. That evening, Cedar Hill Manor's dining room hosted its first full family dinner since our parents' deaths. Michael arrived precisely at 6, bringing an expensive bottle of wine and an uncharacteristic nervousness. Emily flitted through the house with delighted curiosity, discovering the architectural details and hidden spaces that 4 generations of Mitchell women had created and preserved. Rebecca and Daniel brought a portfolio of restoration plans they'd been developing, sensitive updates to the manor's infrastructure that would preserve its historical integrity while adapting it for modern needs. Even Harold Winters made an appearance, bringing the newly discovered letters and staying for a glass of wine before tactfully leaving the family to their private reunion. As we gathered around the table where countless Mitchell family meals had taken place across decades, I felt the weight of the past 3 months, the shock of discovery, the painful confrontations, the gradual rebuilding of relationships on more honest foundations. The journey had been neither simple nor painless, but sitting here with my family, I couldn't regret a single step of it. Michael raised his glass. "I'd like to propose a toast," he said, his usual authoritative tone, softened by genuine emotion. "To the Mitchell women, past, present, and future. May their contributions never again be forgotten or diminished." We clinked glasses, the simple gesture symbolizing a new chapter in our family's story, one where all voices would be heard, all contributions valued, all truths acknowledged. After dinner, as conversation flowed more easily than it had in years, I slipped away to the solarium where this journey had begun with Martin Cooper's revelations. The evening light filtered through the curved glass ceiling, illuminating Adelaide's portrait that now hung prominently on the main wall. I raised my glass to her determined face. "We did it," I whispered. "Your legacy is safe now." The house settled around me with its familiar creaks and sighs, but they no longer sounded like secrets being kept. Instead, they felt like affirmation, like generations of Mitchell women acknowledging that their stories were finally being told. When I returned to the dining room, Emily was entertaining everyone with her plans to research Adelaide's investment strategies for her senior economics thesis. Michael was actually smiling as his daughter outlined her ambitious project, his pride visibly outweighing any lingering discomfort with our revised family narrative. Rebecca caught my eye across the table, raising her glass in a private toast that needed no words. We had transformed what could have been a bitter inheritance battle into something healing, a restoration of truth that had strengthened rather than destroyed our family bonds. Cedar Hill Manor would remain in the Adelaide. Mitchell Trust, managed cooperatively by the 3 of us with me as primary trustee. The Mitchell family law firm would establish a scholarship honoring Adelaide's financial acumen. The Cedar Hill Foundation would support new generations of women pursuing their passions in business and the arts. And most importantly, our family would move forward with a more complete understanding of its history, both the parts we celebrated and the patterns we chose to break. Outside, the gardens our mother had designed caught the last golden light of evening. Tomorrow would bring practical concerns, foundation paperwork, restoration decisions, the ongoing work of maintaining a historic property. But tonight, in this moment of quiet triumph, I allowed myself to simply appreciate how far we had come. My mother's revised will had not just redistributed property, it had realigned our family with its true history, creating space for a future where all of us could contribute our unique strengths to a shared legacy. Adelaide Mitchell had fought to maintain female autonomy in an era that denied it. Eleanor Mitchell had preserved that fight through decades of careful documentation. And now, we would carry it forward, not as a battle against the men in our family, but as a commitment to honoring all voices, all contributions, all aspects of our complex inheritance. As laughter echoed through the dining room, Michael's deep chuckle, Rebecca's musical laugh, Emily's exuberant giggle, I silently thanked my mother for her final act of courage. In revising her will, she had given us more than property. She had given us truth, reconciliation, and a chance to become the family we were always meant to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.